In the last episode, we heard the state regulator and policymaker perspective on what's needed to bring about the right policies and regulation to face the rising challenge of load growth. In the final portion of our series, we'll hear from three more of our competitive power suppliers: Kurt Morgan, CEO of Alpha Generation; Thad Hill, CEO of Calpine and chairman of EPSA's board of directors; and Margie Rosenbluth Phillips, Senior Vice President of Wholesale Market Policy at LS Power. These three share some of the projects their companies are working on and innovation they are invested in to keep supplying the reliable power to meet rising demand. They also highlight what competitive power suppliers need from policymakers and regulators, and where the market needs to move in order for the grid to grow sustainably, reliably, and cost-effectively. Let's jump in. Kurt Morgan, CEO of Alpha Generation, talks to us about where AlphaGen is with load growth and the principles and reforms needed to maximize the benefits of competitive markets to bring reliable, cost-effective, and clean energy to the grid.
First thing I should do is recognize Mark Sudby, who for years has been with EPSA and was the CEO of Eastern Gen. I want to thank him for everything he's done. Most of the people that work for AlphaGen work for Mark, and he's got a very good team. But AlphaGen, is an idea that ArcLight came up with. They had several portfolio companies, and they realized that they had, the kind of size and scale, that some of the major IPPs have, and with the idea that you may have a longer holding period in this day and age, they decided to put all of this together. And when you do that, of course, you've got significant integration issues, and that's anywhere from looking at all your systems and trying to upgrade systems that can support the kind of scale and the size of this entity. You also have some value opportunities around financing, and we're in the middle of doing a large financing that brings in all the portfolio companies. They're combining Eastern Gen, Generation Bridge, and Parkway. And all of those are in ISO New England, in PJM, and in New York ISO.
Right.
And then we have a position out in California as well. I've done this for a long time, and so I know that there is scale benefits that you can get. We also are looking at each of the power plants and doing a performance improvement program around that. And of course, looking for other types of cost savings that you might have by using the scale that we have. For example, procurement, being able to buy materials with a larger footprint, usually you can get better deal in that. So, all those initiatives are ongoing. And of course, ArcLight has just raised a new fund. They still had some money in their Fund 6. They now have raised Fund 7. And so they're also continuing to be acquisitive. We're adding an entity called Lordstown, which is 1,000 megawatt, state-of-the-art combined cycle plant. That's in front of FERC right now. We expect any day that we'll get approval of that. And so they're not slowing down. We have to have an organization that can do all the things I just suggested to do with all the existing portfolio companies, and then add new portfolio companies, as they acquire more.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned that because, we're talking about load growth and demand increases, and you've been in the business, as you noted, for quite a long time. Did any of this growth take you by surprise, the speed with which we've seen this, or is this something that you're kind of used to, having been around a couple cycles where you thought, this is not a surprise, but we've got to respond to the moment? Kind of what's your perspective with your long history in the industry?
Yeah, I will tell you, I was surprised by it. And I'm pretty good about thinking forward, and I thought that dispatchable generation was going to be needed for a long time, but I thought that was because there were a number of sort of premature forced retirements of assets, largely driven by market rules, but also by the EPA and rationing down on the rules that they have there. This is a very different ballgame. I did not think that we were going to see this kind of load growth. And every single ISO now is showing, the hockey stick that, that all the companies used to show.
Yeah.
But the reality is, it's changed. I'll tell you the other thing, Todd. I've been through this a number of times, as you suggested. I think this has some legs to it because I really do believe that, artificial intelligence, but also just sheer processing power, and with electrification, but also with just advancement of technology, the need for power to power the data processing is going to be required. It seems to me that it's a long-lived demand. So it's going to be interesting to see how we meet that. And maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later. But in any event, I was a little surprised by it. And I'm also a little bit concerned about how we're going to meet this, especially with the continued retirement of dispatchable generation and the fact that renewables and batteries are not meeting, especially when you get into ELCC ratings, they're not meeting, megawatt for megawatt, the loss of supply. I never thought I'd see PJM become nervous about reserve margins, but there's no doubt that they are, and I think the other markets are, and rightly so.
Do you have thoughts about what are the best ways for us to try to tackle some of this? I mean, you already mentioned we've got to keep around some resources that are leaving the system early, but are you envisioning another growth cycle where we're going to see new resources added to the system? And how do you think that plays? What's required to drive that investment?
Yeah, well, I'm worried about it because in the past, you didn't have some of the limitations that are being imposed right now, gas assets included, with what came out with the EPA. And so, what you need in markets, competitive markets, is you got to have some stability, and people have to believe that they have a reasonable chance of having a return of capital and on capital. That's how capital markets work. We're capable of building, we're capable of running assets, we're quite good at it. Competitive markets actually have improved availability of power plants. They've also shifted the risk away from captive ratepayers to shareholders, which is good, obviously, for the business. But what is missing right now, what I'm concerned about, is do we have the right runway for some of the new dispatchable assets that I think are going to be needed? I do believe that there's some need for new natural gas power plants in some of these markets, but I question in the competitive markets whether we have, the structure set up in order to get people a fighting chance to get that return of and on capital. And that's a concerning thing for me. And you know where it's coming from, Todd. I mean, we've chipped away at capacity markets. We're chipping away now at some of the ancillary service markets. We are federally funding subsidies for renewables and batteries and allowing them to come in at will. And then the EPA is rationing down on these very assets. Hey, look, I'm a believer, I know you are too, in climate change, but we cannot do it in such a way that we leave these markets vulnerable and that people may not have enough power to be able to live their lives, let alone to fund the economic growth that we need to around data processing, but then to transition to electric automobiles, electric heat and cooking. All these things are happening, and people are wanting them to happen. But at the same time, we are not building new generation in sufficient quantities that can actually meet the needs.
How else do you think we should be right-sizing markets or working on making sure that the market rules will actually deliver the things that we want? I mean, you've kind of said it, I'll say it a little bit different. I mean, we want markets to be investable so that we can get the outcome that people want. There's a benefit that will come from it. Of course, affordability or cost effectiveness has to be part of that, but reliability is paramount. How do we navigate through that as you look at it from the seat of the executive who's running a power generation company?
Yeah, so look, I always thought capacity markets were a very good concept because, you couldn't store electricity in large quantities. That's still basically the way it is. I mean, we are advancing on storage, but, even with storage right now, 4 hours is the most that you can get on an economic basis. So, look, I think that at the end of the day, I'm very much concerned about how we're going to be able, to put the right programs in place and to be able to do this in competitive markets. but also in other markets. And I'm also concerned about it. You know this, Todd, but at the end of the day, people have to be able to afford the product. We're seeing enormous increases, whether it's through taxation and federal subsidies or just expanding margins on the energy side of the equation, because we are running a higher demand. So we have to really think long and hard. How are we going to make these markets work and make them effective?
So as you think about that, do you think about how we're valuing dispatchable resources? You mentioned the effective load carrying capacity a moment ago, the ELCC, for those that may not be familiar. Are those some of the things, or are there additional ways that we need to be thinking about ensuring adequate compensation to keep resources around? Because I share your view that there's resources that are going to grow in importance, but may run with a little different profile, meaning they probably are going to run less. How do you think about closing that gap to make sure you can be paid enough to keep them on the system and they can run when we need them to run?
I thought capacity markets served us well, and they did, by the way. I mean, they were the missing money. And because you have a significant amount of assets that need to sit on the sidelines that don't really make a lot of money from producing energy, but they are absolutely critical, that could be for 1 or 2 weeks out of every year, and you have to have them. I mean, you cannot get by without them. So if we can't live with capacity markets, or capacity markets are being chipped at in a way that they are no longer providing, the essential missing money, I think we have to then step back and look at other attributes. And whether that is, you can call them reliability resources and have a reliability payment. We could name it anything we want, but at the end of the day, you know this, you have to have generation in sufficient quantities sitting on the sidelines to come in. The other thing we did, Todd, is we took what was largely uncorrelated outage risk in power markets. One plant here, one plant there, but it wasn't correlated. We now have created correlated outage risk so that when the sun goes down or the wind doesn't blow, entire classes of assets are no longer there. So in a state of the world right now where reserve margins are shrinking, we should actually be increasing reserve margins. And if you're going to increase reserve margins to make sure you have a reliable grid, and most of those assets are not going to be making enough money from running for energy value, you're going to have to make some payment to them. And again, we can call it what we want, but those assets are essential to a reliable grid. And you know this too, because you and I work together on this. I mean, reliability is the most important thing that we bring to the table. It's been drilled into our heads, and we live it every single day. We also have to balance now, along with that, affordability, but also sustainability. We're willing to do that, but we cannot forget that reliability is job one. And I'm very concerned that the direction of where things are going, that reliability is taking a second position, and that's a dangerous thing. I think the first thing I would say is that, and FERC has to be the arbiter of all this. The EPA their role is to make sure we have, safe water, safe air, but FERC is the one that has to, along with the ISOs, has to make sure that reliability of electric systems. And so I think number one, I would say, is we always have to have a FERC that doesn't wear a political party hat, but cares about reliability and wants to make sure that markets, are fair and true. And so I think that's number one. Second thing is we've got to have rules put in place and allow them to work. We cannot jerk every time there's a price surge and say something's wrong with the market. Competitive markets have periods of time where prices are high. And if people believe in those markets, they will invest and they'll drive prices down. That's the way they work. And I think the last thing is policymakers and regulators have to admit to themselves that we must continue to have dispatchable generation, and that there is going to be some level of a carbon footprint, although one that is declining over time. But we cannot take something that was built over 100 years and think that we are going to completely overhaul it in 10 to 15 years. It just isn't going to happen. And I think if you admit that, and I do see that happening, by the way, I see that admission.
Mm-hmm.
It's not an easy one, and we all want to have, cleanest air we can, and we want to reduce our carbon footprint. But we also have to be realist about this, and we can do major damage to the economy and to everyday lives if we don't do our job as, those who have to maintain reliability of the grid. I mean, and it's becoming more and more important as we electrify the economy.
Thad Hill, CEO of Calpine, talks to us about major projects that Calpine has in its rotation, including the Baytown decarbonization and Sutter energy projects, where Calpine is using carbon capture and storage. Thad shares how markets can address resource retirements and how load growth can best be addressed at the policy and regulatory levels to allow power suppliers like Calpine to generate and bring power to where it's needed. Here's Thad.
Calpine's about 27,000 megawatts of capacity. Of the vast majority of that is our natural gas fleet, almost all late model combined cycle facilities. We are the largest gas-fired generator in North America, and primarily we're located in the competitive markets of the West, California, centered in California, the Gulf Coast in Texas, and then really the Mid-Atlantic through New England with a few plants kind of scattered. We also, as a part of that fleet, have battery projects now. There are two sites, including one of the sites, which is only partially operational, that will become, if not the one of the largest single battery installations in the world. We also have the world's largest geothermal facility in Northern California, where we produce 7 by 24 dispatchable carbon-free megawatt hours. We also have a retail business, which is a pretty decent sized business, although unlike some of our peers or competitors, we're more focused on commercial and industrial, although we do have some residential customers. And then we also have a robust, of course, as you would expect, trading, procurement, and asset management organization.
So Thad, of course, that's kind of where we are, but we're interested in looking at where things are headed in the future. And so resource retirements are a growing concern, especially as we're looking at adding more on the demand side. And we've talked with a couple of other folks that have indicated it's not just megawatts or gigawatts, but it's terawatts in the future of what we're going to need. What does that mean to you and your business operations?
As I mentioned earlier, our gas fleet is late model, flexible, just in a great place. So unlike others that have some coal plants or a lot of older steam units, which have been pressured by some of the, kind of emerging economics, we've done pretty well. These machines can turn on and off a couple of times a day if they have to. So I'm pretty optimistic. I mean, it is just as important as the markets. Not only do they need to incent new generation, they also have to keep the generation that's needed today. But at least for Calpine, we feel we've got decades of life left on our fleet.
Great. So we talk about innovation and how we're going to meet the moment. And you all are leading on some of those things with the Baytown decarbonization and the Sutter Energy Center project. So how are you envisioning carbon capture as a solution for the grid of the future? And will CCS be part of the solution for solving some of these load growth problems? I mean, you are some of the leading people and organizations working on it. So your views are critically important.
It's a really interesting organizational journey. By kind of the mid to late teens, we had become focused instead of development focused, much more focused on asset management and managing our own assets for profitability and keeping them healthy and safe. The world has now turned, as you mentioned. Not only is load growth returning, but the world has actually decided that physics matter again, and that, then I say that tongue in cheek, but these assets and the capabilities to provide matter. So we have kind of old muscles that have been dormant, and we have relaunched in a very meaningful way our development efforts. We, in 3 areas. First off is new gas-fired power plants. We have 2 projects that are committed in Texas. One of them is on our own. One is a partnership with an industrial partner. I will also tell you that we are working with customers in other jurisdictions around developing more new gas-fired generation in places where it's needed to support reliability with customers. So that's pretty exciting. Secondly is our battery development efforts. We've stayed away from traditional wind and solar just because we didn't think we could make the math work. We've been able to make it work with batteries. And not only do we have the projects I talked about earlier, but there's others under construction besides the big one, and there's a pipeline there. Third and final leg of our development effort is carbon capture, as you mentioned. We're very excited. We have large awards, $270 million each, for Baytown and Sutter, one in California, one in Texas. And we were working at Baytown with our host, Cogen. In California, we have a customer, which is Sacramento Municipality Utility District. And we are working away with EPC firms and construction costs and economics to get the stuff done. It's certainly not done, but I'm optimistic we're in a really good place.
From your perspective, what's the best way for us to get where we need to be, and more importantly, to stay there? Because it's probably not just going to be a 1 or 2 year issue. This is going to be an issue going forward for quite some time.
When you look at, there's no doubt load has been flat for 20 years, and there's no doubt that load growth is returning.
Yeah.
I do think that the popular press, and even some policymakers, though, have gotten a little ahead of how urgent the situation is. And load growth is returning. We do need to keep existing assets in place that are required for reliability, and we do need to build new assets. But this isn't happening all at once. I'm not here to suggest that load isn't growing and that it doesn't mean that development needs to be underway. But I do think that people, we need to be methodical and move. There's time, and we shouldn't be afraid, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does. It means take a breath and let's not get carried away and have an overbuild situation, which usually ends poorly across the board.
We're all going to have to gear up to take it on, but I just don't want, again, some of the discussion has been a little more panicked than I think it needs to be.
Yeah, I think that's a good word of caution to kind of keep our heads as we try to solve the problem, know what we're solving for. So I think we're going to get into what I think is the easiest question for you and I to discuss, which is how the benefits of markets will actually help deliver the outcomes that we've been talking about and is driving the investment decisions that you're already making versus the talk that some are having about, well, we should just go back to kind of doing it the way we used to do it through ratepayer funded construction and what have you. And I think it's pretty clear that markets have delivered, but as one of the largest market players, I think your voice carries a lot of impact when you talk about how we're going to solve this. So what's your perspective on how we double down on markets versus how we maybe retreat from things that have delivered great results?
I'll come back to what I think is important to mention. What you mentioned is markets have delivered thousands of megawatts, tens of thousands of megawatts in the places that have been kind of deemed, level playing fields. That's PJM, that's Texas, by the way, all kinds of renewables and batteries too, New England. And so I think there's a strong track record. I also, the alternative to markets is, some kind of rate-based or otherwise regulated or state contracted, whatever the mechanism might be, build. And there are two problems with that I think we've seen demonstrated. The first is an agency issue, which is, in our business, we invest our own money. We don't invest other people's money. And if you,
Right.
If you want to use 3 words to sum up the problems with that, it's Sumner, Vogel, and Kemper. And for people listening who may not know those are 3 projects done by integrated utilities. 2 of them never happened. The third did, but all 3 cost ratepayers enormous amounts of money. And that's just what's going to happen. The other is the efficiency, and obviously, not only, I believe the profit motive to be a powerful thing and things being more efficient. I love this story. We sold a few years ago a combined cycle to a regulated utility. This was a 2x1, operated very safely, very efficiently, and we had 19 employees. The day after the utility bought it, they staffed it with more than 35 people. And the CEO of the utility actually told me that, we need to learn how to do things. And, like I said, the profit motive is a comfortable thing. And I think, these savings ultimately are passed on to the consumer.
That's
so,
right.
it is absolutely, it's got a great track record. It solves the agency problem. It's more efficient. And we've got to harness it.
Yeah.
So now I guess the question is, what do we need to do from where we are today? At the highest level, I think there are 2 dimensions to talk about to make this work. First off, people like us need to believe that there's a level playing field for investing capital. And there are all kinds of different ways you can get there. But, having over time a FERC that's consistent and the tariffs they approve, having the folks that run these ISOs work the market angle and have a set of rules, which over time, they're going to have to evolve. The world's evolving. But with a consistent methodology or point of view has worked. And it's invested all that capital. So that's part 1. Part 2 is to make reliability work. The right kind of stuff needs to be compensated. And the rules changing a little bit on that right now. A megawatt used to be a megawatt. And right now, a megawatt, sometimes it provides reliability benefit and sometimes it doesn't. There are other types of attributes which in the past didn't have to get thought about, which maybe they are needed now. Just maybe two quick
Yeah.
examples to that might be the duration of the resource, or it might be whether or not there's backup fuel. I mean, those are two examples. And so right now we're in the middle of a situation where the first one, the first point, which is level playing field and consistent rules, there's populism kind of going on in this country, and that's a little bit shaky in places. The second one, I actually think is being addressed, and all of the major ISOs are grappling with this right now. And in the West, they've got the slice a day. In Texas, they're different ancillary products. New England and PJM using various flavors of capacity accreditation or effective flow ELCC, effective flow carrying capacity. And so we're in a little bit of a shaky area. As you know, me, Todd, pretty much an optimist. I believe that the ISOs, the work that they're doing on the physics and the products and the capabilities are required is good. It's different by region and its own flavor, but is making progress. And I take heart in Texas to see that with a clear point of view from the PUC and ERCOT, I think we're going to see a lot of capital flowing. Ours is certainly flowing, and I think that will happen in PJM and New England as these rules solidify. And I hope, at least maybe optimistically, that the world stabilizes.
Yeah, I think that would be, as we often say amongst ourselves, we don't need a super high degree of certainty, but we do need a reasonable degree of certainty. Otherwise, people don't invest. I mean, it's not an unreasonable request to have some level of comfort before you write that big check.
Well, again, I just think the track record is so of the amount of dollars and megawatts that have flowed when these conditions are even semi-right. It will
Correct.
happen again. And by the way, things are not perfect in Texas, nor is the table totally set, but the
Yeah.
money is flowing. And I think that will follow in PJM and the like, but there's work to be done first.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to state it, that I think you've captured it precisely. What's needed at the policy and regulatory level to support the markets as we've talked about them and to incentivize the investment? I mean, I feel like there's two pieces to this, right? We've got to stabilize the market and make sure that it works, and then we've got to incentivize the investment to enable we to get the right amount of what's needed, as you noted. Let's not get carried away.
Yeah, well, also, as I mentioned prior, each one of these jurisdictions, but the world has changed. Heavy penetration of renewables, solar and wind are limited in what they can provide reliability. Storage has duration limits. And so, but there's a lot of this wind and solar, which are changing the economics of the remaining resources on the grid. And
Yeah.
I think, and maybe that statement wasn't that simple, but I think in a simplistic way, that's what each of these individual ISOs are trying to solve in their own way. And I actually think they're making progress. I also believe that people have realized that this isn't just about new build, but you also have to keep the existing stuff around until you don't need it anymore. And we don't want where we're having massive retirement announcements and then RMRs because the market
Right.
failed.
That's
And
right.
and I think a lot of these issues, or a lot of these redesign efforts that are underway are being addressed to do that. And again, being an optimist, I think New England and PJM and Texas and California, all in their own ways, are and New York, ultimately,
Mhm.
I hope, are all doing the right things to address this. I do think that the confidence in markets is something that we're all going to have to work on together. And I think part of our advocacy as EPSA is reminding folks that the outcomes are better. But I think the technical side is happening. And I think with that will come new investment. And I think that a good thing will beget a good thing. Again, I'm optimistic.
Since the time of this conversation, Calpine has announced that they are expanding their efforts in PJM, focusing particularly on generation development in Ohio and Pennsylvania. For more information, check out Calpine's press release linked in the show notes.
In our last but certainly not least conversation, Margie Rosenbluth Phillips, Senior Vice President of Wholesale Market Policy at LS Power, shares what's on the horizon for LS and its assets. She talks about LS Power's approach to upgrading existing power plants to produce more, better energy. She shares specific examples of how the competitive market delivers reliable, cost-effective power when it's needed the most, and she highlights the importance of policymakers and regulators collaborating with NERC. Let's hear from Margie.
LS's portfolio is almost 20,000 megawatts. It spans gas, hydro, run of the river, and pump storage, battery storage, solar, and wind. We also own C-Power, which is a leading distribution energy resource provider, which manages another 6,200 megawatts of demand response and energy efficiency. And we also invest in transmission, EV charging stations, RNG projects, and other projects that are sort of in part of the whole industry, but not a direct megawatt, if you will.
With that, Margie, that's kind of where we are today. But of course, this whole discussion is around where are we headed in the future. And so we've got a couple of concerns about resource retirements, but we're adding new load on the demand side. And, we've talked to a couple of folks who are reminding us it's not just megawatts or even gigawatts, but up to terawatts of new load, depending on what kind of growth we actually see. As LS is looking at the situation going forward, what does the future hold for LS Power's existing assets? And then what new assets do you think are on the horizon that LS may be investing in?
Todd, it would be wonderful to predict the future. We do think that we will continue to see policies pushing for carbon reduction. If not at the federal, then at the state level, but it will continue. And we think our portfolio is extremely well positioned for this. There's an increasing realization that gas peakers in particular are needed longer than expected. We've got New York announcing that it recognizes its programs a little bit too ambitious. We have California that shut down its gas plants and now have them back online. We do see some ongoing attempts to force retirement, such as CEJA in Illinois. But we think that with a more realistic assessment of the need to retain these resources for reliability purposes, we will, be well positioned. Again, we're optimistic that basically our gas peaker resorts are the line of last defense in this world in terms of their ability to perform flexibly with fast start for longer duration. And until we have sort of more technological breakthroughs, these gas peakers are going to be absolutely critical to maintain reliability and also a cleaner grid and affordability, all of the goals we hear about from policymakers.
I'm not asking you to break news, but are there any major projects that LS is working on now? I mean, over the last handful of years, you've really developed and deployed a significant battery storage project in California and some other things. But are there things that you're working on that you can share with us that kind of give an indication of how you're looking towards the future?
I would say that look at what everybody else is doing, and we have our fingers in those pots as well.
Sure.
One of the things that we do particularly well and we're proud of is we do take existing facilities and we either add equipment to make them produce more, or we make the equipment perform better. So that is something that we continue to do and do with excellence. And we are focused, it's no secret that, we are upgrading our power plant in New England, our Ocean State power plant. And of course, like everybody else, looking to site batteries, looking at new technological opportunities and things like that.
So you referenced the repowering, but also the growing demand issue that's right before us. And I think we all would agree that we need to build more and build it faster because we've got a little bit of misalignment between how fast some of these resources may come online and how fast we can actually get something constructed. From your position, what's the best way to get where we need to be and then ultimately stay there? And I think that asked other way, how do we get things constructed and how do we ensure that we can keep building enough to power the system reliably?
LS Power has great faith in the competitive markets.
Same.
I know, thankfully. People forget, right, that until about 5 years ago, there was a massive investment in PJM, for example. The competitive markets helped convert a heavily coal-reliant system in PJM to gas, which was cheaper, more efficient. This was also coming out of the nuclear overspend. So the competitive markets helped consumers transition to a more affordable yet continuing to be reliable system. And we think part of the challenge is the market prices have been reflecting market dynamics, right? All the markets have claimed that they have been in excess, and so their prices have reflected it. The most important thing, I think, that we think is that they need to now reflect the difference in supply and demand economics or situation, and the prices need to reflect that change, which is now we don't necessarily have an excess of megawatts, and we need a lot of new megawatts to come on the system. I think also what we depend on is a little bit of, not a little bit, a lot of transparency and also some rule stability. One of the things we're concerned about is we have seen prices erode dramatically in PJM over the past 5 years because of changes to market rules and heavy-handed mitigation.
You kind of walked us right into my next question, which is you've already talked about some of them, but how does LS view the benefits of working in the competitive market versus ratepayer pass-throughs or other ways that projects are financed in other parts of the country? I know there's a number of models, and I think listeners are probably familiar with them, but how does LS view the benefits of that competitive model and what it does both for your business, but ultimately for the three legs of the stool, that reliability, affordability, and sustainability piece that we're always trying to navigate?
You know, my favorite response to that is it's a very simple one. If you look at AEP, which exercised its right for some of its load to not participate in the PJM market, in 2023, their capacity price was north of $450 a megawatt day, while the customers sitting right next to their service territory were paying about $34 a megawatt day. So if that doesn't say it all, I don't know what does. But there are other things involved too, which is, of course, if we don't perform, we don't get paid. There's this myth out there that somehow merchant generators don't care about reliability because we have no obligation or no direct obligation to consumers. And nothing could be further from the truth. First of all, if we can't maintain a reliable system, nobody is going to want to keep competitive markets around. I would note that the competitive markets during Winter Storm Elliott, it was actually PJM that kept the lights on in TVA and some southern utilities. So it's kind of ironic when you start talking about obligations and responsibilities. I'd also note that, you know, when a plant is rate-based, that utility may not have the incentives that we have to go out and try and, you know, install better performance equipment. The ratepayers may be stuck paying for additional power purchases that the utility incurs because its equipment is out. So it always befuddles me when there is discussion around the value that competitive markets bring, because I think it's so demonstrable.
That said, how do you think we should approach right-sizing markets, or I'm not sure what the right term is, but making sure that markets deliver at their maximum value? Are there principles that we need to adhere to? I know EPSA has our own set of principles, but are there reforms that are needed to some of the markets? Because I'll concede up front, they're not identical. So every market's a little bit different, but are there some certain things that you say from our perspective, LS wants to see the following in order for us to ensure that the market's working and it justifies our continued investment?
Yep. And Todd, I would go back to, you know, the key is reflecting supply demand fundamentals and that the prices reflect that and that they not be and then the market rules are not toyed with to produce desired outcomes instead of the outcomes that these fundamentals would produce. We note that there are improvements and enhancements that the markets are looking at. In particular, there's a lot of effort going into saying, what do we need to keep the system reliable? What services, what attributes, and are we providing the appropriate compensation to retain these resources? Of course, we're particularly interested in this because of our gas peakers, which we continue to maintain are probably the most important resource on the system in terms of reliability. Again, transparency, stability, non-discrimination in terms of access to the markets, which I think the competitive markets have generally been very good at providing. Have I hit them all?
Yeah, I think that feels like
one more if I may. So, you know, a lot of the competitive markets, to help them determine what prices should look like and help them guide their market rulemaking, depend on assumptions about the cost of new entry and building. And one of the challenges we have is we don't always update those assumptions in a timely manner. So, for example, COVID and the war in the Ukraine really disrupted supply, raised prices considerably, and yet many RTOs may be working on the basis of costs that were in existence prior to those
Mhm.
events. And so it's really important to ensure that we are working with realistic assumptions around the cost of building power plants and maintaining them.
Yeah, that doesn't sound unreasonable because I know our utility cousins would do the same thing in front of their state utility commissions as they would seek approval of their IRP, for instance. So that doesn't seem unreasonable. As we talk about that, how do you think we need to be thinking about incentivizing new build? We see a number of approaches that are being taken in other jurisdictions. Does LS Power have a view on how we should incentivize new build?
I can tell you our view is how we should not do it, which
Sometimes that's as good an answer.
thank you. We don't think subsidies are effective. They ultimately lead to a disintegration of the market because it artificially depresses prices. And
Sure.
so the resource that you may want to come in today may depress the price so that the resource you want for tomorrow doesn't come in. Also, just as an aside, often the subsidies do lead to long-term contracts, which leave uneconomic and sometimes technologically inefficient
Yeah.
units on the system. And believe it or not, that precludes newer, more efficient, and cheaper units from coming online. So that is something that we do think hurts markets. Again, to get the new build, we are agnostic. We will invest in anything that makes sense and
Mhm.
frankly, that we think will further policy goals of cleaner, affordable, and reliable energy, whether it's through power plants or services, through our transmission, our demand response, energy efficiency business, and of course, our fundamental belief in the value of gas peaking plants.
Sure. You've mentioned it a couple of times now. Do you have an explicit position or something specific about how we should be thinking about valuing dispatchable resources? We've kind of talked around it, but I mean, I think you rightly note that they are the backbone of reliability, that as the grid is changing and as we like to say, as the energy expansion continues, these dispatchable resources are critically important. How does Ellis think about how we should be valuing those resources?
So, one, I think everybody needs to acknowledge the value of the resources. You and I, because we work in a community that owns them and operates them, and we have shared experiences, we know how valuable
Yeah.
they are. It's not clear that that value is as widely publicized as, say, we know it is.
Right.
And when we say that they're the resource of last resort, when you think about it, when the sun doesn't shine, the wind doesn't blow, we have a severe storm, or PJM has bad forecasting, the peakers are expected to respond in pretty short notice
Hmm.
to save the system, quite literally.
Yeah.
And so, one of the most important things we think in recognizing the value is the RTOs have to better align their markets with the physical realities of the gas system. And that's challenging, but it's not insurmountable.
Hmm.
And it also, as we expect these peakers to run less in the future, we probably need to redesign our reserves markets, recognizing that they may not run a lot, but darn, you want them to run when you need them. And
Right.
again, that has to align with, physical realities of the gas world.
Yeah, 100%. So as you think about the broad questions that we've been addressing, what do you think is needed at the regulatory or policy level that will support competitive markets, but incentivize investment and ensure that we get the build out that we need? And perhaps as we've been learning from some of the folks we've chatted with, when we need it, because it's not clear that it's all going to land on us at one time, but it is a horizon that seems fairly predictable. So what are those policy or regulatory changes that LS Power and you think are required in order to deliver that?
Well, I know I'm terribly naive, but I always believe that education will help help guide us to making the right decisions.
Sure.
Sometimes that's true, sometimes not so much. I think it's really important, one, that we all be patient. You won't see new build tomorrow, right?
Mhm.
We have to get the right prices out. We have supply constraints that are coming down the road, and we have interconnection challenges. I want to make the point that these challenges are no different for utility plants than
Right.
they are for merchants. And I think there's this myth going around that somehow regulated entities wouldn't face these challenges. So my hope is that the regulators and legislators actually talk about this holistically and honestly. The other thing I would hope that would be done more in the future is NERC has gotten far
Mm.
more involved in the transition of what resources are supporting the grid. And I would hope that before policymakers and legislators implement new rules or want to get more involved in the market, that they would talk with the folks that are familiar with the reliability issues, such as NERC, such as the RTOs that do produce studies. I'd encourage regulators to work with FERC. We are all working towards the same goal. We
Right.
just don't always agree how the best way to get there is.
Just how much power will be needed as demand grows remains an open question, but there's no doubt as to where the trend is headed. Managing costs to consumers and continuing to find cleaner energy resources remain priorities for policymakers and the public. But above all, the lights must stay on, the beer must remain cold, and the water must be warm. Our digital economy requires 24/7 power to support everyday tasks, the national economy, and critical public health infrastructure and emergency services. AI demand is seemingly not going anywhere but up. Data centers will continue to be built. Chip manufacturing is entering a new frontier, and the importance of reshoring critical industries means more demand is likely coming. The good news is this: competitive power suppliers and energy experts nationwide are ready to face the challenge. They're asking the tough questions. They're investing in innovative solutions. They're recognizing the importance of both renewable clean energy resources and dispatchable, reliable power. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Energy Rush. If you like this podcast series, we invite you to check out Energy Solutions, EPSA's regular monthly podcast featuring the voices and stories from a changing energy grid. You can find all these episodes on our website or your favorite major podcast platform. Subscribe, follow, leave a rating, and comment on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or Pandora. And follow us on X at EPSA News, Threads at Electric Power Supply, and LinkedIn for more news and updates from America's competitive power suppliers. The music in this episode was written and produced by Let Me Hold That, Ltd.
Energy Solutions is brought to you by the Electric Power Supply Association. EPSA represents America's competitive power suppliers, which bring about 150,000 megawatts of power generation resources to customers throughout the United States. The music in this episode is written, produced, and performed by Let Me Hold That, Ltd. Discover the power of competition at www.epsa.org.